All right, everybody, good evening. It is 7 p.m. in NYC and 4 p.m. in Sonoma County, California. I'm Sam Kimball from Crush WineXperiences, formerly New York Wine Events. Thank you so much for joining us on virtual day trip to wine country presented by Citi. We are here for a special session for National Zinfandel Day. Today is November 17th, which is National Zinfandel Day 2021. And if anyone has been with us before and seen our broadcast, you know that I love Zinfandel. I'm a big fan. So this is a special night and session for me. We are going virtually to Healdsburg, California and Glen Ellen, California. And we're having a fireside chat with two extraordinary California founders and winemakers who make iconic Zinfandel. And I can tell you, I've taken a little sip of each of the two wines we're profiling. They are special, and this is really going to be exciting. The wineries represented are Once and Future Wine Company and Limerick Lane Cellars. And from these owners and founders, we are going to be learning quite a lot about California Zinfandel. And so I will spare you a lot of the details because we're going to hear from the experts. But for anyone who does not know, here are a few fast facts about California Zin. Zinfandel grapes came to California. They were brought from Europe in 1852. By 1880, a short time later, Zinfandel was the most widely planted wine grape in the state of California. And you fast forward to today, some of the best wines in the world are Zinfandels coming out of California. And the thing with Zinfandel is, and you're going to learn a lot more about this, and I'm really excited to have our guests talk about it, it's way more than what's in the glass. It's an evolutional world of winemaking, the world of Zinfandel, and we have two special guests who will illustrate these things and talk a lot about the history and the culture of Zinfandel growing and winemaking in California. For the curious, the 2021 stats on California Zinfandel are, it's the third most planted grape in the state after Chardonnay and Cabernet Sauvignon. There are 1,400 plus Zinfandel single vineyard wines labeled with the name of the vineyard on them. And most importantly, we're tasting two of the best Zinfandels out there tonight. We're tasting two really great ones. So I want to welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We've got a great group. Please ask any questions or make any comments in the chat in Zoom as we go. We'll answer those on the fly during the session. This evening is meant to be totally interactive, so we really want to see your questions and your comments. And we've got two really special people, actually three, to answer those. And by the way, speaking of the chat, while we're talking about that, if you would hit the chat right now and tell us where in the world you are logging in from. We love to see that. So we're going traveling virtually to Sonoma County, to Healdsburg, and to Glen Ellen, California. Let's take a look briefly at the land of Zinfandel and where we're headed via video. Oh my goodness, look at this. People from all over creation: North Carolina, Las Vegas, Long Island, Birmingham, Alabama. Awesome. Granville, Ohio, St. Louis, Clearwater, Florida. Thank you guys. It's great to see everybody. Dallas. Wow. Pacifica. Awesome. I think we're going to have lots of comments and questions, guys, in the chat tonight, which is great. All right. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to take a look briefly at this magical land where Zinfandel is grown. Oh my goodness, Tokyo, Japan. I love it. Amazing. All right, let's take a look at this. We're going to show a quick video and then talk a little bit about the wineries and where you can find out more information. And then we're going to get right into it with our guests. So bear with me. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to take a look. So 1 second. All right. Zinfandel, here we come.
An old adage goes, life is about the journey, not the destination. And wow, does California's legendary Zinfandel have a journey. Peppering the Golden State from wind-whipped mountains to fertile valleys. Crossing the calloused hands of a grape grower, listening to the unique perspective of a winemaker. It's a journey measured in miles and vintages. Above all, it's a path unique to every Zin lover. Your Zinfandel trail is waiting. Will you take it?
Guys, I watched that and I think about all the wineries I am getting ready to visit in 2022 that are represented by the beautiful landscapes and vineyards that we see there. This is truly special, and for me as a Zinfandel lover is really fun. So it's an amazing place, an amazing grape on National Zinfandel Day today. We have Joel Peterson, the owner and founder at Once and Future Wine, and also a founder of the Zinfandel and Advocates and Producers, which is the trade association of the wineries, and is a dedicated lifetime to Zinfandel. He's also known as the Godfather of Zin. We have Jake Bilbro, the owner at Limerick Lane Cellars, also a storied history in the world of Zinfandel. And then last but not least, we have Rebecca Robinson, the executive director at Zinfandel Advocates and Producers, which is the association of the wineries that make this great wine. So welcome, Joel, Jake, and Rebecca. It is so great having you guys here.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you. Great to be here.
I have to ask you straight away, where does this broadcast find each of you?
Well, I am in Sonoma, right on the edge of town, not so far from where this vineyard is.
Excellent. Jake?
I'm actually a little far away from Limerick Lane at the moment. I'm actually currently in Idaho. I'm in Sun Valley, but I'm feeling a lot closer to home with this glass of Once and Future in front of me right now. It's tasting pretty good.
Nice. And Rebecca?
I am in the great Republic of Rough and Ready, California, Sam, and it's the home to me and to Zap, actually. So it's delightful to be here with you.
I have to say, and this is, I say this as a true East Coaster, for my East Coaster friends who are on the broadcast with us, there is a town in California called Rough and Ready.
It's such a great segue to the story of Zinfandel because we're in the Sierra foothills, which of course was really populated during the gold rush in the 1840s and 1850s. And of course, all those hardy miners needed something to drink. And so they began planting Zinfandel. And I know I'm getting ahead of myself in the story, but it really fits in so well with the legacy and the history of Zin.
I love that. So the gold rush is connected to the growth of Zinfandel in California, or the introduction of.
Well, I would say, yes, the gold rush is connected with all sorts of things in California. It was not very populated before the gold rush. So all sorts of things, grapevines, fruit trees, other paraphernalia that came to California during the gold rush. So it was certainly the big rush. It wasn't just gold. It was everything else rushed into California as well.
And Steve reminds us that the California missions were there as well, and the Italians in California.
All of it coming together for sure.
Yeah. So I have to ask you guys, and this is really Joel and Jake for you. California Zinfandel is all about the families who grow it, the people who make it, the community that pulls together and collaborates around the growing of this grape and the wines. Your relationship, Joel and Jake, embodies a lot of history over time and families. Can you share with everyone how you guys know each other and how you've been associated over the many years?
Well, I'll start slowly. It turns out that Jake's father and I both had to work second jobs to start a winery. We were in love with the grape, as it were. We both worked in hospitals to keep our body and soul together, probably to keep Jake in diapers. But we both segued out of those hospital jobs into Zinfandel, which was the traditional grape of California. Jake's father did something called Marietta Old Vine, which was mostly Zinfandel. And I started making single vineyard designated wines at Ravenswood in 1976. So we were pretty early in the revitalization of California and California Zinfandel. But the story goes way further than that. Jake, you want to take over from here? Talk about your generation, so to speak?
Yeah, well, I would jump in there very quickly and say that I think my first exposure, quote unquote, and obviously keeping this G-rated, my first exposure to Joel Peterson was a picture that I found of my dad's. And this had to have been the very early 80s. And you and my dad were at a tasting with John Fagan from Calmont Beverage.
Oh.
And, it was after the tasting and someone had taken a picture, but Joel had this really long hair and a beret on, and my dad had big curly hair and a big, huge mustache, and you both were drinking cold beer. I assume it was cold, but it looked like it was cold. And I asked my dad about it, and he said, "Oh, that was a good one. We had a big, long tasting, and Joel and I went out to the lobby of the hotel or wherever we were, and we got a cold beer together." So that certainly goes there. My family history personally, in regards to Italian heritage, et cetera, goes back 4 generations. I'm 4th generation within the wine industry. My 2 brothers and I are 4th generation winemakers. My dad's grandparents emigrated from Italy and settled in Cloverdale, northern Sonoma County. And going back then, they initially and immediately planted grapes, and the grapes, at that point, they would bring to the Italian Swiss colony. My dad's uncle then started, and back in that day, they made all their own wine, et cetera, and bartered and everything with it. My dad's uncle started a winery called Bandiera Winery, which is the facility is still there, actually to this day. And then my dad actually, when he left the winery, when he left the hospital, he originally bought Bandiera from his uncle before he started Marietta Cellars. So we go back a good ways, but I think it's equally important is the time and duration that one has in anything, really, industry or otherwise. It's equally important, the impact. And so while my family has a lot of history, just to even be on a call with Joel Peterson is a consistent pinch me moment. And the Godfather reference is there for the reason. I think, Joel, you and my dad both did set out from the hospital in the 70s, and you both did go in your own ways. My dad was really following his gut and blending wines in new ways and trying to find his way, obviously with his heart firmly rooted in Zinfandel. But to even bring that into the equation with what you were doing way back then with single vineyard, historic vineyards is almost not worth talking about compared to what you did for the grape and for the industry. So,
well, thanks for that. But your pop was doing some great stuff. Marietta was Old Vine Red was a standard. It was just like you knew that if you picked up a bottle of that, it was going to be really good. Obviously Jake has roots within the wine business, but we all have our sort of backstories. And while my family arrived here in California in 1851, they decided to be dairy farmers out of Petaluma. They were whalers who knocked off whales, but gave up whaling. I think the whales ran out. Um, and my mother was a nuclear chemist. My father was a physical chemist, and my mother picked up her first bottle of wine in 1952, which was a Chateauneuf de Pape, I guess. And that turned my parents into wine drinkers. My father started a wine newsletter and started me tasting wine with him when I was about 10 years old. But he very early discovered Zinfandel in California and actually wrote it up for his wine newsletter. And he got almost all the information correct, which was pretty remarkable for that. But mostly what they tasted, mostly what they drank was European wines. And what I learned about European wines was there was a grape that was grown someplace special for that grape. It was grown, it had been grown for a very long time by families who were deeply invested in the land. And it became very clear to me when I started Ravenswood that if I was going to be true to sort of what I believed about the wine business, then I had to make the grape that was deeply integrated into the California history, the grape that actually chose California and thrived here. And that was Zinfandel. You know, making Cabernet or making Pinot Noir, as good as those wines can be, they'll always be kind of ersatz Bordeaux and Burgundy. So we have our own thing here at Zinfandel, and it's really good. The trouble was when I started, there was only one or two other wineries that were making good Zinfandel, Ridge being one of them, Joe Swan, my mentor, being the other one. And they were actually practicing to make other grapes when they discovered how good Zinfandel could be. Zinfandel hadn't been treated very well for a long time, but when people began to sort of treat it with respect, it responded, and it makes delicious, wonderful wines. And looking back now, almost 50 years, I can say that Zinfandel was a pretty darn good choice for me.
Well, Joel, you know, and I think you know this, I got into the wine world and into the wine business 15 years ago because somebody gave me a bottle of really good California Zin, and it blew my mind. And I said, I got to know more about this. And that was really my thing. And as many people who are watching know, and I've told endless stories about Zinfandel and my own personal enjoyment of it, it's well known in California. Here on the East Coast, many fewer people really know the joys and the magic of Zinfandel and how extraordinary it is. So I appreciate your points there.
Sam, you've really become part of the Zinfandel community and the ZAP community too over the last 7 or 8 years since we kind of came together and started plotting on how we could work together and create events and share the story. And it's been really exciting to bring you into this whole Zinfandel community that we've been talking about through ZAP and through the education and the tastings that we do.
Absolutely. And I'm pinching myself being on this broadcast and Zoom with Joel, because as is Jake, we're both thrilled to be here because it's so exciting to have somebody who's there from the beginning and really have nurtured this tremendous legacy. So,
well, you know, Sam, while the legacy and what I've come through and all the people who are making Zinfandel in the best of ways these days are pretty exciting. The people I worked with, the Paul Drapers of the world and the Bob Bialys of the world, the Mike Officers of the world, all dedicated to Zinfandel. It's really exciting actually to see the next gen, if you will, moving in there. People like Jake and my son and others, Tegan Pasalacqua, have sort of taken up the fight for Zinfandel, so to speak, and they're making really delicious wines. Jake, you and Morgan have been working together for a while, haven't you? Morgan's my son, by the way.
Yeah, it's I mean, gosh, I I fear that eventually we would either start to bore the audience or we'd all run out of wine with the amount of stories, Joel, that we could tell back and forth between our families. But the very first vineyard that my dad worked with in the Russian River Valley, which is on Limerick Lane, which is why I knew about Limerick Lane, was the Sedini vineyard. My dad split that vineyard with Tom Rocchioli for decades. I grew up working there with my dad, you know, and it was straight out of the kind of the movies. Jenny Sedini would work down in her little basement kitchen and make fresh pasta and make tomato sauce from her garden. We'd pick grapes. We'd get all the grapes picked. Everybody, not just us, you know, the other pickers and everyone as well. Everyone would sit out under the trees and have this huge pasta lunch after we were done picking grapes and that sort of thing. And that vineyard in particular just had a huge connection with my family. And that was when, as my dad and as Marietta started to evolve more, we turned that vineyard over to Morgan, amongst others. Morgan and Limerick Lane makes a Bedrock Vineyard designate. Bedrock makes a Limerick Lane Vineyard designate. I found out, I did not even know that when I bought Limerick Lane, that the first wines were made by Joel Peterson. And Morgan reached out and told me that. And we actually, Morgan and I went through the library and found those wines because Joel, you didn't have any of those wines left. And so I think that the idea of Zinfandel, I do say this, and I wouldn't normally want to say this. I don't think that the idea of Zinfandel or the ideal of Zinfandel could be better expressed than by the relationship of our two families and the multi-generational relationship of our two families, because it involves heritage, it involves legacy, it involves cooperation and collegiality, and it's everything that Zinfandel is, all the way down to the fact that Zinfandel is always, or at least in my opinion, the best Zinfandels are always field blends with other small varieties that all play their parts and everyone does their thing. But in the end, you get this overarching beauty. And I really believe that about the grape, and I really believe that about our families.
So Jake, that's a great point. And you said something the other day that really stuck with me, and that is, you asked the question and then you answered it. So I want you to tell people about this. What's the difference between a Zinfandel winemaker and other types of winemakers? Nothing wrong with other winemakers, but you know, Zinfandel makers who are dry farmed, and there's a certain type of person. Tell us a little bit about that culture of being a Zinfandel grower and maker.
Yeah, this is kind of a theory, you know, so in a very positive way, and you're gonna think me strange when I say this, in a very positive way, my dad passed away 4 years ago, and he was equally, as you would think, between Joel and Morgan, he was the central person in my life. The reason I say positive is because he was first diagnosed with cancer 10 years earlier, and he was able to go into remission. And in those 10 years, he had all of his grandchildren. My brothers got married. We had just an extraordinary amount of time together. And so in that scenario, you can be nothing but grateful. But within that, I really thought about my dad a lot, and I thought about the industry a lot. And this is a working theory that I've been working on, but I really do believe that Zinfandel winemakers are a different breed. And I've met a lot of winemakers. I've grown up with a lot. I love them all. As you say, everyone is wonderful. But the precision and the clarity that I think attracts, say, a Chardonnay or a Pinot Noir winemaker, all the way down to when you go out into nearly every Chardonnay or Pinot Noir vineyard, or Cabernet vineyard for that matter, you know, the grapes are grown on a trellis, and they're grown, you know, on the wire, and they're just perfectly manicured and balanced. You go out into an old vine Zinfandel vineyard, akin to the one behind your head there, Sam, and you have so much variation, and you do not have the ability to control. And I don't know that I've ever met a Zinfandel winemaker who wasn't more willing to go in for the bear hug than the handshake. I've never met a Zinfandel winemaker who didn't have just an extraordinary level of soul, I think would be a pretty good word for it. I think that would certainly, soul and spirit, I think that would, those two words would certainly, you know, wrap up the Joel Peterson ideal into one scenario. But when I think about it, you know, in order to make Zinfandel, I used this example the other day. It's similar to music. I think that Zinfandel winemakers are similar to blues or jazz musicians, because you have to be willing to not know how the song is going to end. And you not only have to be willing to, you kind of have to revel in that. There's a beauty in a field blended old vine Zinfandel vineyard that's dry farmed and interplanted with Alicante Boucher and Trousseau and Negrette and Syrah and Petit Syrah. And you don't know how they're going to affect the end flavor, and you got to roll with it. And that kind of slight laissez-faire attitude and joy for the process and acceptance of the lack of control. I've never met a Zinfandel winemaker who didn't jump to taste or trade bottles with me. I've never met a Zinfandel winemaker who didn't jump to help me out, and vice versa. And like I said, I've never said hi to Joel Peterson without getting a big hug. I mean, I just think there's a brotherhood, so to speak, in that style of approach to the process. And again, that's by no means negating other grapes or other winemakers. But Zinfandel is not a variety that works well in a lab and in chemistry first and foremost. There's a gut that's involved, and I just think that without that, I don't think you could stand it. You got to roll.
I think you're also describing the draw of Zinfandel vineyards to individuals, people who kind of like the adventure of Zinfandel. There's a reason that there are, 100 and some odd single vineyard designated, wines out there that are Zinfandel, in part because the vineyards are as unique as the winemakers, and each one loves to sort of take and establish the uniqueness of the vineyard, but also put their own stamp on it. I just did a wonderful tasting with 5 winemakers, all of whom make wine from Bedrock Vineyard, the same vintage, and looking at the core sense of the vineyard itself, but also looking at how different winemakers spin a different story in that vineyard. So you can tell the personalities there, but boy, the makeup is different, and the sort of the whole enthusiasm factor that comes from different directions from these winemakers is really fun to evaluate. Yeah.
If I can just jump in here too, what you both are describing so much is really brought forward in the collegiality of a ZAP tasting as well. And I see that so much, and that's what keeps my heart in this, and seeing you guys get so excited about tasting each other's wines and finding out what's going on, and just having that connection also with Joel, as you say, the people who love Zinfandel, who want to share in that experience. And we've seen that for decades now at ZAP and at the tastings that we do. And it's so exciting to, again, now have this new format of being virtual and being able to share that. Although we're not in the same room and able to do bear hugs, it still is a remarkable story and a remarkable thing of what you two are bringing to the table in terms of the world of wine. And it's been my privilege to be able to go along with it for as long as I have. And I just love it. I still am. So it's always exciting to get together and hear these great stories.
Well, it was certainly what we had hoped for when we got together to start ZAP 20 some odd years ago. It's not usual that a group of competing winemakers, and let's face it, we were competing winemakers that really established a collaboration to create something like Zinfandel Advocates and Producers, not only just for the producers. It wasn't a trade association. It was an association that included advocates, people who were really interested in Zinfandel and wanted to participate. And it's had legs for a really long time, in part because there are people out there who know just how good Zinfandel is and how much fun it is. I mean, it's a wonderful it's a wonderful grape, and it expresses itself in great ways, and it has lots of fans and lots of dedicated winemakers.
You know, Becky, to your point about the collegiality and the collaboration that Joel and Jake are talking about, I see that Dave from Bialy Vineyards is on the viewer list here, and you know, Dave, we love what you guys built over there, and the black chicken, and I mean, what a perfect illustration of what you just said, Becky. I mean, people coming together and hanging out, and still to this moment the same. So it's a wonderful culture. I wanted to ask each of you guys, Joel and Jake, before we jump into tasting these two special wines. Joel, this will be for you first. What, for Once and Future Wine, somebody who has no familiarity with it, what's the calling card, or what's the sort of unique factor that you would like people to experience from your wines?
Well, Sam, as you probably know, I started Ravenswood back in 1976, and it was a tiny little winery. It was like 327 cases in my first vintage. And it kind of got out of control. So by the time I left in 2016, excuse me, it had gone through a public offering. It had been absorbed by a giant wine company constellation, and it had grown to nearly 1 million cases. So when I left, I had to ask myself, what do you want to do with the rest of your life? You probably have good 10 or 15 good working years left in you. I'm 75 now, so I've been doing it for a little while. And really the answer was, I would really like to have the winery I wanted to have when I started Ravenswood. I wanted to have a little winery where I did all the work. Jake pointed out that I had long hair in that photo. Yeah, I was a sort of a back to the lander, and this was going to be sort of my life. So really what I've done is I've gone back and I'm making wine the way Joe Swan and I made wine. I used some of the same open top redwood fermenters that I used in the 80s and 90s. I'm making wine pretty much all myself with a little help from my friends, my son and others. But I empty out all the vats and punch things down. And so it's really a winemaking adventure for me. And I'm making wines for myself now, not just for, the market per se. Yeah, that's me.
That's Joel in the tanks there.
In the tank. So really, I'm making wines that really come from my heart, and I'm using vineyards that I consider to be some of the best, most legendary vineyards in California. So my chances of making good wine are pretty high because, as we all know, the core value in any wine is the vineyard. So basically, wines with heart and soul that are simply made, and wines that I personally would prefer to drink.
Well, I think that's a great summation. Very quickly, and before we move on to Jake, we have a question from Eddie. Joel, what did you find was the core of the 5 winemakers from that tasting you recently mentioned, and what was the difference that you saw?
Well, like Old Hill Ranch, bedrock is on the Agua Caliente bench, and the Agua Caliente bench has very definitive sort of structure and a red, black fruited baking spice character. Those are the core values of that vineyard. It's a dry farmed old vineyard that produces somewhere between 1/2 ton and 1.5 tons an acre, depending on the year. So very low production, relatively small berried, so high skin to juice ratio. So the core values really are the baking spice character, the sort of reddish black fruit, and the very distinctive structural component. So that was there in all the wines, but they varied from being softer and rounder. There are several producers that use high polysaccharide producing yeasts that sort of build the sort of sweetness into the wine. There are people who use American oak, which changes kind of the nature of the way the fruit interacts with the oak. There are people who use French oak, some use more, some use less. So some pick earlier, some pick later, which the earlier pickers tend to emphasize more of the red fruit. The later pickers tend to emphasize more of the dark fruit character. So yeah, and there were substantial differences in the finished pHs of the wine. Yeah, so basically there were shadings that were different, but the core value remained.
Gotcha. Thank you. Jake, same question, Limerick Lane, what's sort of the unique aspect of the wines, and what do you shoot for at the winery in that regard?
Good question. I would say from a unique aspect perspective, what always amazes me, especially about the 1910 block, which is the 111-year-old vines on the property. When I think old vines Zinfandel, I also think of I often think about that intensity of fruit. And what really astounds me is the floral aromatics that vineyard tends to produce. It's not what I lean towards. That old vineyard really, it's delicate, it's feminine, it's not the concentrated, beefier side of Zinfandel. And I certainly personally attribute that to the terroir and the climate. Where that leads me to is everything that we do at Limerick Lane is to really try to honor what was there and what is there. And gosh, not to circle back to the same old thing. When we bought Limerick Lane from Mike Collins, the original founder, I tasted through the cellar and blindly tasted a certain number of wines where I said, those are the wines that we're going to make. And sure enough, did it turn out that those were the wines that Joel made for Limerick Lane back in the day. And that's what we shot for. As we worked there, we truly, we definitely work in the vineyard. And one of the things that I've learned, first working with my dad across all of Sonoma and Mendocino County and Zinfandel vineyards across 2 counties, I've never worked at another vineyard or worked with another vineyard where it tells you when it's ready. And that window, when those grapes are ready, is very, very brief. And you can be sitting there and you can test bricks all that you want. You taste those grapes and they taste like acid and water. And basil leaves start to turn yellow, everything else, we don't get shrivel. Acid and water and acid and water, and all of a sudden there is a burst of flavor. And what we have learned, and I have learned this the hard way, is when you get that, you pick. Because if you don't pick right then, everything shrivels and you lose the vineyard. We generally pick at a relatively to very low pH. And that was something that concerned me. And I was saying, we can't pick yet, it's at a 3.2 pH. But we get a pretty significant malic shift where the vines inherently balance themselves at a later date. And the biggest joy for me, going back to like that idea of music and winemaking, was really turning off my head and opening up, my ears and listening to what the vineyard was saying. And as we did that, I think as we've done that more, I think that we've made, regardless of scores or accolades, I think that we've made better and better wines that are truer and truer reflections of the site.
That's great. That's an amazing answer. And I love the fact that the original goal was to make wines that it turns out were the one like what Joel made earlier.
The irony, of course, of that, Sam, is that the Collins and I parted ways because they didn't think the wines were big enough. They wanted them to be chunkier. But as Jake points out, that site tells you when it's ready to pick. And it does have this kind of ethereal perfume that is, really the part of the value of that site. It makes it really interesting and makes it very much what it is. Jake's in a very interesting position there with Limerick Lane. He's kind of right on the bisection of Russian River and Dry Creek. So it's not as cool as Russian River, but it's cool enough to keep his pHs, well within the bounds of great winemaking. But it picks up a little of the warmth from Dry Creek. So it gets enough warmth to have ripeness at the same time. It's a rare spot, and it's a lovely spot, actually. It makes very pretty wines.
How is, before we jump into, and let's in a moment start with these two really amazing wines. And man, my wines are working in the glass. I mean, I poured them 45 minutes ago and they're just getting better and better. How is Zin a terroir driven wine? And I think you started to touch on that, Joel.
Well, it is, first of all, many of the vines, in fact, most of the vines we work with are very old. So they have really deep roots. They're very connected to their place. They've lived there for a long time. They tend to produce lower quantities of fruit than younger vineyards. The berries tend to be smaller, so the intensity of flavor that comes from that site is magnified by that particular situation. Zinfandel itself is really an interesting grape. Unlike Cabernet, which has a pyrazine character to it, or Pinot Noir, which has a very narrow window in which it can produce good wine in terms of climate, Zinfandel is a very broad-based grape. Its flavor spans from strawberries to blackberries and plums. And each different site emphasizes some part of the character of Zinfandel. So in a warmer site, it tends to get more of kind of the black plum, almost porty characters. In a place like the Russian River, it takes on this wonderful kind of blue-fruited, high-acid character to it. In a place like Sonoma Valley, it has structure and line and raciness associated with it. Sierra foothills end up, because they're higher in elevation and granitic soils, have this really interesting, almost cherry cola quality to it. If you move down to Paso, they take on that particular area, which is a slightly earthy, deep berry kind of character. So each of these locations forces its imprint on the Zinfandel, but the Zinfandel has got enough flexibility within its flavor profile to make really unique wines from these particular regions. And within those regions, there are very special vineyards which make wines, that are more often great wines. And of course, there's always a bunch of good wines too. But there's some very, very special vineyards in each one of these areas.
And that is why he's the godfather of Zinfandel. I could not have told you that. I don't have that experience. I'm fourth generation in this industry. I don't have that experience. That is the level of practical knowledge that is floating around between Joel's ears is just second to none in that regard. That's all I want to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I gotta echo Jake, Joel. I mean, you just said more in what seemed like a hallway conversation tone about terroir and flavor and grapes and characteristics than anybody's said in I don't know, we're on broadcast number 90 or something with these virtual tastings. So,
Sam, something that I would add to that now that I think about it, I was in France a few years back and I was tasting with, we were tasting a bunch of different wines from all over the world, but we were tasting, it was not a Zinfandel, but it was a very, very, very ripe wine. And there was a French winemaker there who, in a very good-natured manner, he pounded his fist on the table and he said, "A raisin tastes like a raisin, tastes like a raisin." And he goes, "I don't drink wine to taste raisins. I taste wine to drink grapes and the place." And so while Joel is probably one of the few people in the state of California or the world who can, identify all these different regions and flavor profiles, that's, I think, the second part of terroir is the true, role of the winemaker. And it's really not the winemaker, it's almost a wine guide or a wine shepherd. And that's to make sure that you are assisting in that terroir's ability to express. And what I'm loving so much when I'm at ZAP tastings and when I'm drinking Once and Future and everything else is appropriately picked and appropriately ripe wines that then do taste of place and they don't taste of a raisin. And I think that that's something, I think that this is a real heyday right now for Zinfandel. And I think so actually compared to other varietals too. I taste, I don't want to pick any out, but I taste some of those bigger, bolder wines and they taste like ripe fruit and oak to me. And it's really hard for me to determine or to nail down where they might be coming from. And the beauty of Zinfandel, beyond who made it and beyond where it's from, is then you can even go into what's the field blend and what are the other varietals playing into in this vintage. Geez, maybe the Zin was picked at 24.5 bricks, but maybe the Alicante Boucher was at 22 bricks. And so many other factors come into play. And I think that goes back to the why I think it's so exciting to work with Zinfandel, because you get to play with all those things. It's not just one varietal grown on a wire, all the same, and you pick it, and it's you're playing with a much bigger deck of cards.
Well, it's like you said, it's like jazz, it's like bebop. You got to roll with the improvisation of it. Rebecca, can we please get these guys out to the East Coast to do some in-person events with us in 2022?
I think that would be amazing, Sam. I think it's time to wind it up and make it happen for sure.
Excellent. Well, on that note, so the wines we're tasting today, we're going to start off with Once and Future wine. Joel, we're going to taste, correct me if I'm wrong, the 2019 Old Hill Ranch Zinfandel. Tell us a little bit about this. I know you're not a fan of pairing cheese and wine, but I've got a cheese I want to suggest for this. And I know Becky has a dish to suggest with it as well. But tell us a little bit about this one.
Well, first of all, the vineyard has got a wonderful and unique history. Like so many vineyards I get to work with, it has a lot of people who came before me. So this vineyard was originally planted in 1855 by a guy named William McPherson Hill. And he actually replanted the vineyard again after phylloxera and around 1885. And it was a time of exploration in California. They really didn't know what they wanted to plant. Zinfandel very quickly became a leader. But this vineyard has, I think, 20 different grape varieties associated with it because they were trying lots of things. And there was at that particular juncture in the 1880s, there were some recommendations from people who, like Wetmore, who thought about the importance of co-planting, particularly with Zinfandel, to make a more balanced, more interesting wine, and also a wine that essentially allowed you to have more opportunity to make good wine in almost any kind of condition. So this is a dry farmed, very old vineyard. I first saw it in 1975 when Joe Swan was looking at it. It was in pretty bad shape. It was covered with old cars and dead refrigerators and poison oak and buckbrush. And it was purchased along about that time in 1981 by a guy named Otto Teller, who was a dyed-in-the-wool organic farmer who called me up and said, would you like to help me bring this vineyard back? And so we spent a number of years cleaning things out. I made the wines. I was getting less than half a ton an acre off of it. It's gone through some generational changes now. Will Buckland is now the owner and farmer of it, totally organic. He's totally rebuilt the soil profile. This vineyard now gets 3 to 3.5 tons an acre as opposed to that half ton it originally got. and it looks like it's ready to go for another 100 years. Every vine is an individual. It's got some unique characters to it. Hey, Sam, I've got a little picture that might be fun to share.
Yeah, absolutely.
I do a screen share for this one.
Yep, just share screen and plop it up there.
Okay. Says the host has disabled screen sharing.
Oh, geez, that's not good. Hold on.
Okay.
We shall fix that right now.
Okay.
All right, let's see. You should be able to share it.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Joel, yeah, if you move your browser over, Joel, there you go.
There we go. So hang on just a second. I'm going to put this up to the full screen. There we go. So can you see that, Sam?
Yeah, it looks great.
So this is the anatomy of Old Hill Ranch. This is, oops. This is what the vineyard looks like. Each one of those little spots is a grape variety. The green is obviously Zinfandel, but it's got Grenache. This particular vineyard has a surprising amount of Grenache in it, more so than a number of other old vineyards. It's part of what makes this vineyard as unique as it is, but it's also got Mourvedre and Carignan and Syrah and Petit Syrah and Alicante Bouschet, and just goes on and on. It's like a veritable historic mix of grapes that made their way to California between 1850 and 1890, and they're all in here. It is about 80% Zinfandel rough and dirty. But these other grape varieties are really important. And as Jake pointed out, the Zinfandel can get to 24 and a half, but the other grape varieties generally are later ripening, not all of them, but the majority of them are. So they add something to make the wine more complex and more interesting. So if you look at Carignan, for instance, Carignan is a late ripener. It has fairly high acidity. So as Zinfandel begins to lose some of its acidity, the Carignan kind of steps in. And great wine always has good acid. It's part of what keeps it moving. And there are lots of people who like to talk about Zinfandel being a spicy, peppery grape. Well, it's actually not the Zinfandel so much as it is the Petit Syrah in the wine that adds that extra dimension of flavor profile, that kind of black pepper, white pepper thing. And then things like Alicante Bouschet, which is actually related to Grenache. It's Grenache and Peterson. Grenache and Petit Bouschet crossed, but it's a tintour, so it gives you extra color and depth. So each one of these grapes has a contribution to the overall mix and the character of the wine, which is part of what makes Old Hill so unique, but it also is part of what makes it a wine that is good year after year. It flexes with the climate and the conditions in the way that 100% pure variety.
Hey, Joel, quick question for you. A couple people have asked, how big is the Old Hill Ranch vineyard? And also, where is it in Sonoma?
It is about 24 acres. It is in the middle of Sonoma Valley, toward the south end, just north of Agua Caliente. If anybody knows where B.R. Cohen Winery is, it is kind of right in behind B.R. Cohen. It's called the Old Hill Ranch because of William McPherson Hill. There's not an old hill there, but there is an old alluvial fan there. So the soils are sort of gravelly loam, really ideal for dry farming.
Awesome. Tell us a little bit about give us your tasting notes on this wine. which I'm loving. I've been having it with you advised me to, if I had to have cheese with it, to have a triple creme, which I'm having, and man, is it good. But tell us, I am not going to pretend to do the tasting notes. I gotta kick that one to you.
Well, first of all, when you put it up to your nose, the first thing you sense is this kind of dark fruit kind of wall of sensation. It's got, and if you pull it back from the nose, you get that plumbing black pepper, slightly camphory character that is pretty typical of this vineyard. It's young. I use French oak. I use about 30% new French oak. So you get a little bit of the vanilla of the French oak sort of wrapped around all that, really pretty fruit. But there's not a hint of overripeness in this, even though the nose is very dense and very spicy. There's a freshness and a brightness and almost a citrus note that comes off the top of it. And you put it on your tongue, it just spreads out, and you get this kind of distinct kind of black fruit, mouth-watering, freshness comes out of it. And then there's a very distinctive, Sonoma Valley structure to it. Part of that structure is Grenache, but it is what every wine needs to sort of keep it going for a long time. I have the good fortune to have a library of the older wines that I've made at Ravenswood. And I made, for instance, the 1991, which I opened recently, in really the same way I made this wine. And that wine is still vibrant and vital and really interesting to taste, as are a lot of the wines from that era. So, I not so long ago opened at 86. These wines last for a long time because they're balanced, because they have density, and because they've got really good internal structure.
Now, besides the Thanksgiving meal, which a lot of the traditional parts of that meal go great with this wine, what's your favorite dish to have with this wine?
Well, I am actually a vegetarian these days. So I have actually been drinking Zinfandel with a lot of mushroom-based dishes or tomato-based dishes with chickpeas and beans in them. And, beans can be pretty bland. So you want something like this wine to actually freshen them up and make them sing. And it works quite nicely with that. But I think that, sticking to the kind of the Mediterranean, sort of based diet, the tomatoes, the garlic, the olive oil, all these things go well with these wines. After all, Zinfandel is a native of the Adriatic, Croatia, and it grew up with flavors like that. And it's still, even in its California iteration, tastes really good with foods like that.
Roger recommends mushroom risotto, which I think is a great call.
Absolutely.
And mushroom flatbread.
Ooh, yes. I've been making lots of pizzas recently, and it works really well with pizza.
Let me tell you, I don't think there's a pizza that my good Zinfandels don't go with. Excellent. Well, it's so awesome, and what I love about tonight is it's quite different than Jake's Zin, which we're about to profile here. Jake, you are featuring the 2019 block Zinfandel from Limerick Lane. Tell us a little bit about the provenance of this one, and let's get into learning a little bit more about it and its tasting notes.
Yeah. So we named it the 1910 block, and I have always been aware of the fact that when you say the 1910 block, it's a tongue twister times 10. So apologies for that.
Yeah,
and
you got me on that one.
Yeah, I would love to get Joel's idea on this after we go through the wine. Um, I I I wanted to put the year that the block was planted. That was really important to me, more so than characterizing it as old vine. I felt like that was somewhat of a nebulous term, and I didn't know that that really conveyed to the consumer, the age. And I know that a lot of different people have different definitions as to what is old vine. And so we very specifically label, our Zinfandels by the year the block was planted, if they're from the older blocks. This block is interplanted with Trousseau, Negrette, Peterson, a little bit of Alicante Boucher, Syrah. I think that this is pretty textbook Limerick Lane. I think it's certainly got a really high-toned profile aromatically, as well as palate-wise. To me, it just always blows me away, kind of that lavendery, potpourri, really feminine, beautiful, bright, floral, but fruit component that's just unusual. One of the things I thought about earlier when we were talking about it that I think this wine really shows, if winemakers do their job right with terroir, with expressing terroir, then wines are distinct. And when wines have a high level of distinction, that to me is the most appealing thing. And sometimes that distinction, and one could argue like the acidity level in the 1910 block, or one could argue other things about it, might be considered by some a flaw, but that also is what sets it into its level of uniqueness. It's like Marilyn Monroe's mole. It's the thing that just makes it so you can't stop looking. It's the thing that catches it, and I love that with this wine in particular. That floral, high-toned potpourri note, I end up wanting to smell this wine sometimes more than I want to taste it.
The bouquet is extraordinary.
Yeah, we certainly picked it. Again, this vineyard tells you when it is ready. We picked it with 0 raisoning, like none. I'm gonna guess, if I remember without looking at notes, low to mid 24 bricks. It may be soaked up to 25 in its entirety. We get very little soak ups on this. The pH generally is 3.1 to 3.3. We'll get a shift, and the finished pH will be closer to 3.4, maybe 3.5. But you get this beautifully balanced wine. One thing that Joel said that I really, it just reminded me about, to me, wine is a 3-legged stool. I learned this from my dad. You need to have acid, you need to have tannin structure, and you need to have fruit or richness. And if you ever have any of those, if you don't have those 3 things, the wine won't age. And the proverbial low-hanging fruit with Zinfandel is fruit. And it's really easy to focus on that. But I think both of these wines, as well as so many others, when you just get that beautiful freshness from the acidity and you get tannin structure, I want to feel it and taste it. I mean, that's when you get something really special. I was going to show you pictures too, and I can't share them because I have them here. I don't know if this will come through, but if you guys can see that, maybe, let me see if I can get it there. That is my dad, my brother, and I when we were little kids on the forklift at Marietta in the Dry Creek Valley, where he started. And if I can get this one to get the glare right, that's me over my dad's shoulder after a long day during harvest, giving a thumbs up. But I know that Joel has just as many pictures as I do like that. And again, that's the beauty of it. It's not even the collegiality of winemakers. It's the familiality of winemakers. It's the fact that I'm friends with Morgan and I'm friends with Joel, and that Morgan was friends with my dad and spoke at my dad's, not at his celebration of life, but it's kind of the last big party we threw for my dad when he was very sick. It seemed really appropriate to share those pictures because we are tasting a site and a place, but any good site And any good area of terroir has a family that cares about it. I just don't think you can have one without the other. And so it takes a family, it takes people to honor and preserve these, just like what Joel was saying. You know, you look at the another godfather in the industry, and Will Buckland, who preserved and restored the Old Hill Ranch and mapped it and all of that stuff. He may not make the wines, but that's a family and a person. I thought, Joel, when you shared that picture of the map, and then you click to the other page, and there was a picture of Will leaning over the tractor, grabbing you and hugging you. I'm like, see, there it is again. It's the same old thing. It's the people who are tied to these types of vineyards that are tied to this type of wine. And I just think that that's intrinsic, and you can't extract one from the other.
I was actually going to share that picture after you just said that, because what you were saying just fed right into that. Yeah, how much fun we have actually out in the vineyard. But I want to go back to your label for a minute.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the label too, Joel.
Because the label itself is so unique, and it's a wonderful expression of what Jake was talking about. That is a cross section of an old vine, and like trees, vines have growth rings, and each one of those rings represents a year of age. And you can see that this is the 2019 vintage, and there's a little line running to the ring that's 2019. And I think Jake told me that they're going to put another ring on every year. I hope he's working long enough so that it'll extend out over the edges of the label. But they're also, if you look closely, you can't see it on this, but if you look closely, there are little silver dots on various lines, various growth rings as it comes out. And those are important moments in Jake's family's history. It's a really nice tribute to his way of thinking about Zinfandel and about family and how all those things come together.
Thank you, Joel. I was walking around the vineyard one day, and I really was thinking that this is such a special place. And I wanted that to be something that I could convey to people. And I found an arm that had broken off of one of our old vines. And I started looking at it closer, and it gave me an idea. In addition to the familial dates that are important, my dad's birthday, my children's birthday, etc., there are global events. There was the Judgment of Paris. There was the year the Berlin Wall came down. There's the 1934, the year that Prohibition was repealed. And what just amazes me about Old Hill, about Bedrock, about the Carlisle Vineyard, about Limerick Lane, about Monte Rosso, you could just keep on going, is, well, you can't keep on going. There's a finite amount, but these special places, you know, Limerick Lane has been there since 1910. And while Prohibition was repealed, while world wars occurred, while Berlin Walls, while countries came and went, there was this little block of grapes that just kept on growing and being there. And there's something so grounding, and there's something so almost familial even in that. And to know that while all of these things happen, this just cyclical, repeated seasonal occurrence happens. I mean, I just feel like that is the epitome of Zinfandel. And what I love most is that while you can taste multiple people's versions of Bedrock or Limerick Lane or Old Hill, you can't taste multiple Old Hills. There's only one. And if it's not exemplified by that map that Joel shared, there is no other wine in the world than what you will taste from Once and Future Old Hill that year, that time. There's no other mix of those grapes. I think that is probably what makes Zinfandel the most intriguing to me, which is that the 5 acres of 1910 block at Limerick Lane are the only 5 acres like that in the entire world. That's it. And if we're lucky enough to make 350 cases, that's all there is of that. There are other Zinfandels, there are other wines, but there is no other 1910 block.
It's so fantastic, Sam. It really is. And thank you for putting this together and allowing us to be a part of it. Zap has been, the cheerleader for Zinfandel for 32 years now, and I can't wait for the next 32. And I know these guys are going to play a big part of that. So It's terrific. And yeah, National Zinfandel Day is a great opportunity, like you said, to pause and take a glass of that Zinfandel and say cheers, and can't wait to be together again.
Absolutely. And it's all about the context, Rebecca, of hearing Jake and Joel and people like them talk about how these wines are made and how the grapes are grown. And it's great to just to take that pause. I am really encouraged by the fact that there are people watching who are on the East Coast and in the Midwest. We want to get more folks like that to understand and experience the magic of California Zinfandel. And so, you know, there's Chris I saw from Long Island. I mean, we got to get these folks, Joel and Jake and others, or Rebecca, over to the East Coast and to New York and spread the love in person in 2022. So we'll work on that.
So Sam, let me put up that last picture just so you can see what you'll come and see, the joy of making Zinfandel and being part of that.
Okay, great. And then after we do that, Joel, somebody asked me to put up the screen again with the URLs, so I'll do that.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And Joel, in the meantime, as you're doing that, you know, again, people can go visit zinfandeltrail.com to plot their travels to visit you and to visit Jake and many of our other wonderful wineries and experience Zinfandel firsthand in California as well.
So there you are.
There they are.
We're out there in the vineyard, all working together to pick the grapes. You know, it's really a joint effort, this vineyard. We all work in it. We all do things. The far right is Jake, who is a viticulturist, and my son Morgan, and myself, and Will, the old guys, and Chris. And then there's the dean of organic farming, the hippie organic farmer, Phil Kattori, who drives a BMW. So he's doing okay. So it's an interesting group of people, and I'm sure that, you know, Jake could put up an equally mirthful picture, just because it is, you know, it's a wonderful place to work and to be part of, and to be part of the Zinfandel culture is very special. And thank you, Jake. To be on screen with you is also very special. You are a unique and wonderful human being doing a great job with some old vines.
And I want to thank Joel and Jake and Rebecca for being on the stream tonight. You guys are awesome. And I can't wait to get out to Zinex in January, Rebecca.
Yay, Sam.
Guys.
Great. Well, we hope to see everybody out there, and can't wait to just be with everyone. And fantastic wines, you guys. Just it's such an honor for me to join you tonight. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
And great wines for Thanksgiving.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes. All right, everybody, stay safe. We'll see you soon, and we'll see a bunch of you at Zinex in January in San Francisco.
Thank you
Sam.
all.
All right,
Thank you,
guys.
Joel.
Be well.
Thanks,
Take
Jake.
care.
Thanks, Becky. See you later.
Thanks.
All right.
Thanks, Joel. Thanks, Jake.